Good morning, everybody, and it brings me great pleasure to continue our conversation series, Breaking Silence. I'm delighted to welcome today Nicola Myall, who is an emergency care support worker who worked on the front line through the whole sort of COVID era. She's quite unique in respect of she's experienced things from both her professional position in the NHS and working with paramedics, but secondly, she's also seen it from a couple of perspectives, again, that are unique. She was a patient and also a relative of a patient, and we'll go into that as we go into the conversation. But yeah, sad indictment really that we all have to we're all scared, aren't we? All the people I previously spoke to, we've all had to leave or be pushed out to be able to feel the freedom to speak out through fear. We were promoted, I said on previous conversations, we're promoted to whistleblow and to freedom to speak up, guardianship. It's very protected until you do. And so, like I say, it's a great pleasure to introduce Nicola. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. I just wanted to say as well, it's a very relaxed kind of podcast conversation. I know Nicola's quite nervous, but she's got a great story to tell, and fair play, Nicola, and I really do appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. So let's go right back to the beginning. Give me a couple of thoughts about, when did you start thinking something iffy was going on about COVID, and what was your kind of eureka moment?
Okay, so when 2020 started, the January, February, we were not in lockdown. We were still going out as normal. We were busy. We always are busy. You start getting busy October, November, right through winter because of flu. Every year, pneumonia, flu, especially the elderly and the young. So January, February, I don't recall a lot about that. I know I went on holiday in February. We went away to the Canary Islands, and we weren't in lockdown then. I remember that we were wearing PPE, but we didn't have to. We weren't made to wear it. And the PPE that we had, I call it my subway outfit because I could make a sandwich in it. It didn't protect us. It was a plastic apron and a paper mask. So we were wearing that going into patients if we wanted to. That was at the beginning.
So it was a choice, and it was essentially just a cut, and it was literally a piece of PPE that is usually single use. So let's say the Great Plague of, the zombie apocalypse was doing the rounds. Firstly, you had a choice, which is good. But secondly, it's pointless rags and pointless flimsy plastic, as opposed to a proper fitting mask or a hazmat suit.
The thing that used to make me laugh with it was that if you had your apron on, I mean, we're in and out of the ambulance between the ambulance and houses and the ambulance and the hospital, where you'd walk outside and a gust of wind would get you and your apron would be up in your face and you'd be like, well, this isn't going to protect me. So it did.
Yeah.
I think I started about then, and I started questioning, thinking, well, they're saying this on the news that this is going to be really bad, but to me, I didn't see anything different to any other winter. I've worked in hospitals prior to working in the ambulance service. I knew that we were always busy, but then you had the people working with you that had fear. So going back, I then got really poorly with flu, which was what I thought it was flu. I didn't put it down to COVID or anything, because at that time, the tests weren't out, the PCR tests that were worthless anyway. And I remember being off work for 2 weeks, and then we were going into lockdown and the propaganda was coming out on the TV, and I remember being really scared and thinking, oh my God, what I'm seeing on the TV is people dying in the streets. And I remember phoning my mum. I was going back to work on the Sunday. I was on a 7 in the morning till 7 in the evening. And I remember phoning my mum the night before, and I cried because I went, I'm really scared. And I wasn't scared for me. I was scared about what I was going to see and how I was going to deal with the public. Because when you've worked in the ambulance service and you've dealt with death, the hardest bit is not, and a lot of the time it's not the patient you're dealing with the family. And obviously when you've got to tell somebody that you cannot save, or you've tried to save their husband, wife, or whatever, and then you've got to go and tell the family that you can do it. That's probably the hardest part of my job I've ever done. So I was really scared, and I remember going to work that day, and you get to work, we're logged on to on the ambulance. Now, usually on a Sunday, we're really busy because you've got the overflow from the night before. Now, there's not a lot of ambulances on the roads on the night shifts anyway, so you get called backing up, and in winter, you'll get to work on a Sunday morning and you'd log on and straight away you'd be out for your first job. So I'm thinking, oh my God, it's going to be manic. And we logged on and it sent us to standby. And I remember that was probably the first moment I went, oh, so if your brain starts going, oh. So we were sent to a standby for 2 hours. And we were sat there for 2 hours, no jobs coming in. So, like,
were there other paramedics around, other ambulances around doing the same, just sort of waiting on standby?
I mean, what happens is you have standbys in the area, and you go to one standby first because you're central to a town, and then there's different standbys. So we were at the one, would probably be fourth down the list. So that means that every other standby is full up with other paramedics. So they won't send you all to one standby. They'll scatter you around so that you're in a vicinity. If a call comes in, you're close by. So we were there for 2 hours, and I was like, this is really bizarre. So my first job, I remember like it was yesterday, because we went to this lady and she was bedbound, and the district nurses had put bandages on her legs, and they put them on too tight. So when we removed them, her legs were black. We needed to get her into hospital urgently. So that was my first experience of having to tell the patient's family that they couldn't come with us. And that, to me, was just cruel. It was just awful. And I remember turning around.
So that was just a blanket thing, Nicola? Was that just a blanket thing? So the policy at the time was that if you were admitting a patient, you were transiting them into the hospital, then sorry, you can't come. You weren't
allowed to take family members into the hospital. That was it. You weren't allowed visitors in the hospital. So we weren't allowed to transfer anybody with relatives in the back of the ambulance. So he was okay, but my heart was just like, no, this isn't right. So we took her into hospital, and that was the first time I'd been into hospital since the lockdown. And I mean, the lockdown was the most eerie time I've ever worked, because you're driving through the streets and it's deserted. It was like doing a night shift in the day. It was the most eerie time because there was nobody, and you just driving. You're the only people on the road. So we got her to hospital, and I walked in, and there was nobody there, and there was no patients. We would usually go into the rapid assessment area, and winter time, sometimes we'd be stood for 2 hours waiting to hand our patients over because the hospitals were so full, and we'd be queuing down the corridor. Sometimes we had to wait with patients on the ambulance for them to come and assess them, and we would have to stay with them patients because obviously we can't leave them in the corridor, so we would have to stay with them patients. And this was every winter, that we would have to do their obs every 15 minutes and monitor them. So that would take us off the road, which was an absolute nightmare in the winter. So we walked into the hospital, and I remember walking into the rapid assessment area, and there was nobody there. There was no patients there. And all of a sudden, I've got 2 nurses coming at me, and it was a good for the woman at the time because she needed treatment urgently. But I remember just looking around thinking, where is everybody then? It was a bit of a like, you're in a surreal.
What were the doctors and nurses doing? Were they literally waiting for you to come in, like they were that bored, or were they doing any dance routines, anything like that?
They just sort of appeared from nowhere. You know, it was just like there was nobody. A lot of the time we would go in, and especially during lockdown, and the hospitals are empty, and the nurses would just be sitting around, and there's empty beds. You know, A&E waiting room was deserted. So I think that was sort of a bit of a wake up poor for me. But obviously, I was still in that mindset that, well, the news is telling me that this is really serious, so it must be. But as time goes on, you start going.
Were you doing these
They're
shifts,
just
Nicola?
not.
Were you doing these shifts and then going home, flicking on the BBC and seeing a completely
Yeah,
different world? It was so very different, and I saw that. I was sat
yeah,
bored out my brains in urgent care centres and primary care centres, big federations of huge numbers of patients with a third to a half filled. And you were ringing up the COVID positives, and they got cough and cold and sniffles. But in my spare time, I'd go into the local hospital with a local politician, publicity stunt for her, really, taking
yeah,
pizzas in, and I had the same experiences of delivering Dominoes or kebabs or chips or biscuits from Tesco into the heroes to find myself swamped,
yeah.
throwing bread to the pigeons in the park, and I was looking around going, well, there's bloody patients in A&E. I'll take them down to the COVID ward, and you'd see one bloke, elderly guy in traction, and they're saying, no, he's COVID positive. I said, but he's in traction, he's got a neck of fever fracture by the looks of it. And they're like, oh yeah, well, he's tested positive on entry. And we'll come to that now in a second, actually, about the policy. So you're at that point where you've took the patient from the home into the hospital. You told me a couple of worrying things yesterday about the sort of, you were greeted sometimes by like spacemen. Other times there were just people were just ferried through without a test. And put in the COVID ward, even though. So you've seen both sides, really. So take me through that.
Everybody was tested, but what they were doing was, whether the tests weren't coming back straight away, and before the test results were coming back, they were putting people onto the COVID ward. And this is when I started getting very angry with the system, because I was like, right, I tell you one job I went to, and it was a man. He was diabetic, he was overweight, he had an infection in his leg, so he was under the district nurse. Now this infection had started spreading up his leg. In medical, you know what an infection looks like. You've got the heat, you've got the redness, and it was going up his thigh. So when I got to him, I did his observations, and his oxygen sats were sitting at 94, which is slightly lower than what we want it to be. So, and I always put it down. I always used to say to people, look, we'll always do a second one because we call it white coat syndrome. When we used to walk in, I'm the same when I go to the doctors. I get nervous, my blood pressure goes through the roof, and everything goes on. So we got him onto the ambulance, and we had iPads. So we would put all of the observations down, we'd write everything, and that would go directly to the hospital. So we didn't have to always hand over. So it was great, because if we had an emergency and we needed doctors ready and waiting for us when we got to the hospital, they could look at our information and they would be ready when we arrived at the hospital. So I got him onto, bearing in mind he had an infection in his leg, so his infection markers were up. Blood pressure was high, temperature was high, but his sats were sitting just below where we wanted them to be. So I kept an eye on him. I plugged him in onto the system, onto the machine in the back of the ambulance, and I watched his sats, and they were sitting at 95, 96, 97. So I redid all his observations again when I got to the hospital. Now, I was going to a different hospital because we were out of area. It wasn't my normal hospital. So I wrote all the things onto the iPad, and we took him in a wheelchair, and I was greeted by this, she was awful. And she was the sister in A&E that evening. And she stood there, she wouldn't let me get into A&E, and she went, he needs to go to the COVID ward. And I went, excuse me? And she went, no, look, his sats are 94. I went, no, his sats are sitting at 97 now. They're absolutely fine. He's here for a leg infection. No, and I was getting really, but you can't fight with these people because they're so in this mindset. So I'm in a different hospital. I didn't know where. I was like, well, where's the COVID ward then? She went, it's there. And as I turned round, it was one of the green screens on the wheels that they move around. COVID ward was behind that. So I started laughing. I was just like, well, so that's going to protect people, is it? And she just, she got really, because I had that attitude by that point, because I was just like, this is ridiculous. So this poor man, and I felt so sorry for him. So I said to him, I'm going to have to take you through. And luckily, there was a really nice doctor. And I handed over the patient. And he looked at me and he went, why is he in here? And I went, exactly. Why is he in here? I said, he's high risk. If this pandemic is like what you're saying, he's high risk. Why are we putting him now into this? And he went, okay, he said, I'm going to put him in a side room. So he was protected. And I said, and I think you need to go and speak to the nurses out there then, because I argued with her that he shouldn't be in here. So I was witnessing that everybody that was ill and they were hitting the markers, they just automatically went, well, we'll put them in. And
so they could have so they could go in with a UTI, they could go in with anything really. The way the score system, there's a Muse score, isn't there? The sepsis. So it doesn't matter that this guy's got potentially either cellulitis or worse still osteomyelitis. He's got no evidence of any respiratory illness. And like you say, sometimes traces will read 94%. Once they're in and warm and settled, you'll find often with a good pulsation that they're sitting at 96. So there was absolutely no evidence this guy's got COVID.
No, there was nothing there.
And was this like a widespread phenomenon, Nicola? We said you give us one example, one case vignette, but we seeing that a lot.
Yeah, everywhere. I actually went to my team leader in tears because I got to the point where I felt like if I was taking people into hospital, I remember taking this little lady, everything was pointing to a urine infection, and if you're out about, and at the time we couldn't get hold of GPs to help us, so nobody else was going out to these people. These people weren't being seen by anyone else. It was just us in the ambulance service that were having contact with these people. So I remember this lady, and everything was pointing to a urine infection. We took her into hospital, and they put her on the COVID ward, and it broke me because I went to my team leader, and I was like, look, this is wrong. I said, because we are now putting everybody into the COVID ward, and they haven't been, their test results haven't come back. And he went, but what if she's got COVID? And I'm like, but what if she hasn't? And I was getting really angry, and all I got, and I'm almost in tears at this point, because I'm like, look, I feel like I'm trying to do my job. I joined the ambulance service because I wanted to help people, not to do what they wanted me to do. And I said, I feel like I'm putting a death sentence on these elderly by taking them into hospital, because I knew they were putting everybody that had the markers straight onto the COVID ward. I don't know whether these people ever came out, because we never get a follow-up. We just do the bit before they get into hospital. We can't follow up on our patients. So I don't know. But in my heart, I knew what I was doing was wrong. And I went and tried to speak to people, and I was just shot down. And it was just like, it's policy. Every time I question something, it's policy. And I was like, but to me, if that was my nan or my mum, and she'd gone in with a urine infection, and then you put her on the COVID ward, and then we know what they were doing once they got on the COVID ward. They were putting them on to, what's it called? Ventilators. And the protocol was wrong for the COVID. But they were then putting people in that had no signs of COVID. They didn't have the cough. They didn't have the shortness of breath. It was just like, well, they've got this, this, and this, so we're going to put them straight onto the COVID ward.
It's just peak insanity, isn't it? Like you say, by their definitions, then everyone who walks in the hospital that's got, like say tachycardia because you're nervous, or blood pressure because you're an unresolved blood pressure, but you've gone in with a head injury, are they going to stick them on the COVID ward? Can I ask what you saw the other side of that? You said there's like a sort of a separation between the COVID ward and the general punters. What was going on special the other side? Was there hazmat wearing suits, or was it just a normal ward? Was there anything specific?
It just got, I can't remember when it came out. I mean, we were talking about 5 years ago. I can remember the things, I remember bits of it, but I can't remember, I couldn't tell you the time of when this happened, but it got to the point where we would get to the hospital, and there'd be a nurse stood there in the foyer. So we weren't even, so you'd go in the first door, and it's like the foyer, and then the next door into the hospital, and they put the nurse into the foyer with their computer and everything, and they were in full hazmat suits, with goggles, mask on, apron over the top of their hazmat suit as well. Yeah, but us, we were out in our little subway outfits, and it was just like, but the fear that they were putting on people to see that when you walked into the hospital was absolutely, it was just like, but you're doing this, and I've just been in the back of that ambulance with somebody on my own for the last half an hour, bringing them in, and all I've got is a paper. So it was just like, if you're going to do it and it's that dangerous, why are we not all? I mean, it came to the point that when we were 12 weeks in, this is from lockdown, and they sent out an email to us saying that we had to wear masks in the front of the ambulance when we were driving. And I was like, we're 12 weeks in, and I've been sat with these people. I've been in and out of the hospital. If I was going to die, I would be dead by now, because I'm not one of the young ones, but my immune system is obviously very good. And it was like, who are you doing this for? To me, it was like, people are seeing us driving around in the ambulance, and they're going to see us with masks on. So it's portraying this fear again to the general public. Now, if it had been that bad, why did we not have that put in first of all? So we were being
Did you see anyone though, Nicola? Did you actually see any physical COVID patients that you're called up, they're COVID positive from a test in the community, they're gasping for air, they were rushed through into resus, straight to ITU? Did you ever see any of that? Like the portrayed COVID patient gasping for air? No.
I took 2 people in. I mean, I came off the road in the October in 2020. I got injured. I had quite a severe shoulder injury, and I think it's a blessing. It took me away from what I was dealing with. And in that time, I took 2 people in, possible COVID. One was an alcoholic, so he had underlying issues. And the only reason we had to take him in as COVID is because he had a cough. Now, if that had been the year before, we would have probably left him at home. And the other man had underlying, he was a very sick man, he had kidney failure, and they were the 2 in 6 months when everybody was out there being told to wear masks and social distancing. I didn't see anything, but then my brain was not working like other people's, where I was not going, everything's COVID, this is COVID, this is COVID. I had a conversation with one of my paramedic crewmates one day, and I said to her, you know, she had not let her children out. She was living in that fear base. And I said to her one day, but I haven't seen anything. She went, well, I did, and this man died, and he was only 50. And I went, okay. I said, did he have any underlying health conditions? She said he was morbidly obese. And I went, there you go. You're putting this down to COVID, but you're not looking at the health of that person before you're assuming it's COVID. If it had been last year, he could have died last year because of his obesity. You're putting strain on every part of your body. We are not meant to be like that. Our bodies are not built like that. And it was just like, I'm talking to people who are qualified paramedics they were just like, it was blinkered. I was working with her on a 12-hour shift, and it was the one time that I'd taken somebody in onto the COVID ward, and he was the one with a lot of underlying health conditions. And we walked into the COVID ward, and I remember I got told off that day because I'd forgotten to put my PPE on, and I walked in, and all these nurses like, and I was like, quickly, it's got nothing, and I was like, oh God. So we were stood with our patients, and we were waiting to hand over. So I'm stood in what was now classed as a COVID ward, and I remember looking around, and I was listening. I was constantly listening and watching what was going on because nothing was making sense to me. So I was listening to the handover. Now there was people sat, and they were all with nebulizers on because it was, I think it was sort of summertime, so the asthma was starting. So they were coming in with asthma. They were being put on the COVID ward. And I listened to this handover, and they were saying, oh, they're going home. So I turned around to my paramedic friend and I said, so if COVID is that bad? Where is everybody? And she just looked at me and I went, how many beds are over there? And she was like, 6. And I went, and how many are full? 1. I said, those 3 people over there that are sitting over there, they've got nebulizers on. I said, they're all going home. Where is everybody? And even when I was pointing it out to her, she still didn't understand where I was coming from. I was like, well, if we're in the middle of a pandemic, why are we not back to back with jobs? Why were we sitting at standby? Why were we being fed with pizzas and goodies? Was that to keep us quiet? And it was just like, when you're awake and you're seeing everything, it's really hard because I've been in a parallel universe. And
it's so hard to explain that, though, Nicola, though, because I went around the empty hospitals and you still, even to this day, get doctors saying it was heaving at the rafters. And you're like, well, it wasn't, though, was it? I made several visits in. My sphere of NHS work is outside of the hospitals nowadays as a primary care GP, but I used to be an A&E doctor. You never clear the ambulance backlog. They're up the corridors 24/7, 365 days a year. Exactly. And suddenly the pandemic, and you could hear a pin drop. And it was just this whole thing. Can I ask you a question about what happens if you got into you met this hazmat suit wearing nurse, matron, senior nurse, and they've got their stick ready to wedge up your nose? What happens if the patient says no? What, have you seen anything there?
I never saw a patient say no. They didn't get asked.
They didn't ask. So it was literally just if somebody was like half conscious, they'd just have the swab out and no consent. Because again, I hear stories lots of, and I've got somebody coming on later in the week saying about, if people refused to have the swab, they were treated like an evil individual. And actually, in one case that I dealt with was refused. They had a strep throat, and they had stridor. So this is like an ENT emergency, and they were refused because they wouldn't put a mask on or have their nose swabbed. They just said they didn't want to.
I remember taking a lady in, and she had throat cancer. And I said to her, don't put a mask on. I said, don't put one on in the back of the ambulance. And when we got to hospital, they said she needs a mask. And I said, no, she's got throat cancer. And I think they did back off that time. So I said, no, you're not doing that to her. She's, she was end of life anyway. She was dying. Don't do this to people. But I saw there was no compassion. I took a lady in, I said to you yesterday that we'd gone to her, she'd had a miscarriage, and we'd had to take the baby out of the toilet. She'd lost her baby down the toilet, and it was horrific. And we had to take her to hospital because she'd previously had a miscarriage and she'd had a bleed, so she needed to go in. So not only is she distraught, we can't take her husband with her, and there's 2 children in the house as well, so we're trying to keep everything as calm as possible, and I've taken her into hospital. Now she's distraught in the back of the ambulance. Obviously she's just lost her baby, and we wheeled her through, and the hazmat suit person just straight away, straight up the nose, straight down the throat, and they made her throw up.
That again, sorry, made her vomit, literally vomit.
Yeah, yes. Because they forced it down her throat so far. Now, this lady had just lost her child. Where's the compassion? It was just, there was no reason for her to be tested. She'd had a miscarriage.
And left the partner at home. You were not allowed to bring the grieving partner as well. In such circumstances as to miscarriage on the toilet, and just. What happens there? I mean, we know, like you say, logically speaking, there's no respiratory symptoms here. She's had a miscarriage. She's got a potential for postpartum hemorrhage, for want of a better phrase, really, or post-miscarriage bleeding, incomplete miscarriage, and they won't let the partner come. I mean, how is that justified when the partner and the patient have got no respiratory symptoms? Like you say, it's absolutely insane. Exactly. I can't see how those decisions were made.
No. And then they were talking about ITU being full up with COVID patients. And this one day, we'd got a call. We had to blue light transfer this gentleman from the hospital he was in to another hospital for treatment, and it was heart problems. And we got up to the ICU, And we weren't allowed into the ICU because we weren't in full hazmat suit. So we got locked out and we gave them our stretcher. So I'm like, we was twiddling our thumbs for about 10 minutes waiting for them to give us our patient. So I turned, as I was waiting, a nurse came in and I said, oh, she was like, oh, who are you waiting for? And I said, oh, yeah, it's, we're transferring him to a heart specialist hospital. And she went, oh, we've got a lot of those at the moment. And I was like, oh, okay. And I said, how many have got COVID in there? Sorry. There was only 17 beds in there, I think it was, 17, 18 beds. Now, when they were telling people on the news that ITU was full, there's only 18 beds. Now, that covers an area of thousands of people. So if you put that into perspective of how many people were in ITU dying of COVID, even if it was full of COVID patients, it would be such a small percentage of the amount of people in the community. So the percentage that was in there with COVID of the beds was minimal. But at the same time, they were still spouting on the news that, oh, ITU's full and people are dying. And it just wasn't like that. And,
yeah, they were interviewing on the BBC. You'd see these goggle imprinted like nurses and looking emotional and distraught, and I couldn't connect the two dots because I had that experience. ITUs were quiet. Somebody told me once they were pointing around all the unvaccinated, ventilated COVID positives, but then they'd actually say, well, he's a neck of femur that went wrong, post-operative complications. Technically, he was COVID positive according to their PCR. He was ventilated, and he was unvaccinated because at the time, he probably didn't have a chance to. But he was going around, and none of these patients, not one, they were all ventilated. They're all COVID positive because they were doing it on entry, as you mentioned, and they were all unvaccinated. But that had no relevance to the reason they were on that ventilator. They were stepped down from surgery, strokes, or stuff like that. And how can these people not see it? I don't understand that psychology.
Yeah, I think that was the hardest bit because where I worked, there was probably about 350 people that worked there. And I'd come off the road in the October, and then they started telling us that we had to be vaccinated. And I'd already said to my husband, I'm not doing it. I'm not having it. I said, it's scaring me because it came out too quickly. And I wanted to question, any other vaccine, you're talking 10 years before it's released. And all of a sudden, we've got this pandemic, and within a few months, you're telling me I'm going to have a vaccine. And I was like, no. And I'm very stubborn anyway. You tell me to do something, I'll go and do the opposite. If you ask me nicely, I'm fine. But if you're pushing me into a corner, I've always been the same. I'm like, nah, this isn't happening. So I was off the road, and I'd gone in to work to take in my doctor's note. And I'd walked into the office. Now, the offices at work, they didn't have to wear masks because they were sitting down. So if we walk,
that's the key, though, isn't it? That's the key. If you're sitting down or you've got a substantial meal in front of you, COVID whizzes on by and ignores you.
Yeah. So we
idiocy, isn't it?
Into the office with our mask on. As soon as I sat down, I was safe, so I was allowed to take my mask off. So I'm like, this is just stupid. And I remember sitting there, and I had a team leader sitting next to me, a team leader opposite me, and the manager stood next to me. And
already that situation, Nicola, that is already intimidating in itself. You got two leaders and a manager stood over you, not sat there being protecting himself from COVID, but stood above you. And then what happened when you had this kind offer?
And he was stood up.
So did you accept their kind offer?
No.
Take us through the process. What happened?
So they said, oh, you can go and get your COVID jab. They were doing it at the 111 call centre. And I just sat there and I went, no, thank you. I said, I don't want it. I said, and I was honest, I said, it frightens me. And straight away, the manager turned around and he went, why does it frighten you? It's just an RNA vaccination. And I thought, well, first of all, you've missed out the M at the beginning. So I just went, okay, and I thought, I'm not going to argue because I was feeling a little bit intimidated. Like you said, I've got 3 of them that are all COVID. I would call them COVID idiots that's my
COVID cultists.
So my team leader then turned around to me and he went, well, you're not scared of getting COVID then? And I went, no, no. I said, for my age, because I was one of the older ones in the paramedic service. I mean, when it hit, I was 48 years old, so I should have been at high risk. And I went, no. I said, I think for my age that I'm quite fit and healthy and I've got quite a good immune system. Oh, and it was like, oh. And then the girl opposite me, she turned around and she went, oh, I suppose you think that we're going to get 3 heads then? I went, yeah, exactly. And then the manager turned around to me and he went, well, I'd rather believe what the scientists tell me than what you read on Facebook. And I just turned around and I was like, okay. And I went, I don't really go on Facebook. I said, I just put pictures of my dogs on there. And I got up and walked out. And I just thought, I'm not having this conversation with you. You are not going to bully me into something that I don't want in my system. I've been ill a lot of my life and I've been through the health system. I've been put on medication that has made me ill. I've had to have other medication to correct that. So my fear of medication is quite high because I've learned to self-heal myself with supplements and diet. And I was like, that. No, I'm not going to be bullied into this. So that was it. I never had it and I wasn't going to have it. If it had come to me losing my job, I would have lost my job over it. I was not going to be forced. We didn't travel. We cancelled our holidays after that. And we didn't. And I was like, no, I don't know enough about this.
Well, the point is, Nicola, you should have been told. So they've offered you a jab. They pulled you into this very intimidating, coercive situation, standing over you, giving you zero information. And that's what was happening on a grand scale in what I used to call the jabatoires. They're lining all these people up who trusted the doctor who was giving it. Even the doctor didn't know what was in it. I've asked, I mean, one of my friends, Debbie Evans from the UK column, literally wrote a letter to Sir Brian Mulholland, who's the head of the RCGP, and said, we don't know what's in it and we've got no safety data. Imagine saying that at the end of the line. Hi Doris, got this jab here, don't know what's in it. It's an mRNA gene-based therapeutic laced with lipid nanoparticles that have never been exposed to humans. We've got no long-term, short-term or medium safety data. Roll up your sleeve, love. I think they'd have told you to go away. But I mean, what have been the consequences of you saying no that fateful day when you formally became an anti-vaxxer, as it were? Were you shunned by friends, family, staff? What was the reception?
Family, yeah, everyone, basically. It was hard. It still hurts now. I think, yeah, the names that you get called, oh, you're one of them, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're this, you're that. And yeah, it was hard. It was really hard because especially when your family, the ones that I remember phoning my mum right at the beginning and saying to my mum, they're lying. They're lying to us. And I was literally hysterical and phone, like, they're lying to us, mum, something's not right. And she was like, who's lying? I don't know. I don't know. I said, but what I know is that what they're showing you on the TV is not what's happening out there. Then, I mean, I just went into this downward spiral because I was fighting not only the policies that they were putting out, but you're fighting against colleagues and you're also trying to protect your family. And if your family doesn't want to listen, that's really hard. My children did, thank God. My children didn't get vaccinated. My son nearly did. He wanted to go on holiday and I begged him not to. I said, please just wait.
But again, that's the point. People were having the jab for their job or for the holiday. And I never heard a genuine ever with my own ears anyway when I worked around the jab abattoir, but not in it. Because I was the only doctor seeing the patients while these guys were at Jab Central going like pneumatic drills in people's arms.
I know. I remember I was off work. I was signed off sick because of my shoulder. Because obviously I couldn't do my job anymore. I couldn't even lift the bloody equipment. So, and I remember my friend coming round and she went, "Oh, well, you could go and train and do the vaccines." I won't tell you what my response was to her because it wasn't polite. And I think she took a bit of a shock when I lost my rag, basically. So I went, are you joking me? At the end of that, I've sat here. She's one that's gone and got a jab. She's one that's distanced herself from me. But it was just like, what? So I can go and earn good money, but I can kill people. So, yeah, that's not my moral compass. My moral compass was always, I want to help people. I didn't join the NHS to be rich, because obviously you'll never be rich in the NHS. I was one of the lowest paid in the ambulance service, but I loved my job until 2020. I loved what I did. I loved helping people. I used to love going to people's houses, and the elderly were just adorable. And so I always used to say, can I just have my own ambulance where I go to the elderly and help them back up off the floor? Because I loved those patients. They were always so lovely. But 2020 changed me so much. I saw so much cruelty during lockdown that I couldn't, it really did affect me mentally.
Mm-hmm. You told me a particularly harrowing example. You went out to a nursing home, and do you want to take the story from there?
Yeah.
And what they did to that old lady? I have to find
I'm going to take a breath before I do this one, because this one, I think this was the one that completely finished me mentally, because I'd been going to jobs anyway where I had one lady, her husband, he'd had a stroke, and she was basically his carer. She was looking after him at home. And he was 90, and we got there, and he was very dehydrated, and we said, we need to take him in. And of course, she just went mad because we couldn't take her with him. And the hardest bit for me is that I wanted to say, I had her in my arms crying. She made me cry that day because she had family on the phone trying to persuade me. And I said, look, this is not me. If I could do it, I would take you. I said, but I had she was in her 80s. If I'd taken her to the hospital, they wouldn't have let her in. So then I've got the problem that I've taken an 80-year-old lady to the hospital. It was raining. It wasn't a pleasant day. And she was going to me, we live in a nanny state, you're corrupt. And for me, that was just tore me to bits, because I was just like, I understand where you're coming from. And if I could change anything, I would. So I was going to people. There was another lady that we took in, and they'd just been left. That he was in his 90s. I think he was 91. He was such a lovely man. And he thought his wife had had a stroke. But when we got there, it looked like her dementia had escalated quite a bit. And we had to take him in. And I remember getting her into the chair and him saying goodbye to her. Sorry, I get really emotional talking about this. And him saying goodbye to her. And I'm like, this shouldn't be happening. It was just cruel. And
there was no rationale, clinical rationale, was there? There was never a rationale for it. Like
no,
you understand that if there is a respiratory disease going around, if they had symptoms or signs, but then they flogged the whole asymptomatic thing, didn't they?
Yeah. She was dying, and I still wasn't allowed to take him in. And I had to stand next to him while he said goodbye to her. And I remember thinking, God, this could be the last time he sees his wife. And I'm stood here witnessing this. And I had to go back. I had to go back and knock on the door and ask for something. And he opened the door and he was crying. And he was on the phone to his son. And his son lived down in Portsmouth or something. It was quite a distance. I said, tell your son to come. He said, well, we're not allowed to because of lockdown. So you've got a 90-year-old man who's locked in his house, just said goodbye to his wife, and he's got nobody. Nobody was going to go and visit him. They had told, she'd come out of hospital and they'd had the rapid response carers in, and they had assessed her and said that she didn't need carers. She had dementia and she was escaping out of the house, and he said he wasn't sleeping because he was scared that she was going to run out into the road. This is what they did to people. They just left people. And when you're witnessing that and the cruelty that they did, people didn't see any of that because people weren't out on the road. And it was really hard because I was working with people who were meant to be caring people that didn't bat an eyelid to what we were doing. It just, none of it felt right. It wasn't right.
Mm.
And then, the nursing home. Right, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to wipe my eyes. So the nursing home, I was on a night shift, and we got a call to say that a lady had fallen over. Now, in the nursing homes, policies are they are not allowed to move that patient or client, whatever they want to call them. So I don't know why they're first aid trained, you know, they should not leave people on the floor. So we've gone into this nursing home and it has come up on our system that it was high risk. She was COVID positive. So we walked into this nursing home again, just with my normal PPE on, and apparently I'm walking into this lady who's got this disease. And when we got in there, she was like, "Oh, we're at the other end because she's COVID positive." I was like, "Okay." So we walked down this really long corridor, and when we got to the end, again, it was one of those green screens, which made me laugh again because I'm like, well, the virus isn't going to go underneath it or over it then. And we walked in, and this little old lady, she was locked in a room, shut in a room. She was 94 years old, and she was on the floor.
What, literally locked? As in key turned locked?
No, I don't think it was locked, but she wouldn't have been able to get out of there anyway. So she sat on the floor. She was, oh God. She was sat in her own urine. So that, straight away, I'm angry because you're locking her up. And I turned around and I shouted at the carer. I went, "How long has she been like this for?" Because I think the job had been waiting 2 hours because it's low priority. So we have to go to the high priority first. Now, as you know, as I know, an elderly person on the floor for too long is dangerous. So she'd apparently been on the floor for 2 hours, and she said, "Oh, we checked her 20 minutes ago." Like, it's the middle of the night. You've got a lady who's on the floor. Why is nobody sitting with her? You've got nothing else to do. So where are you? So my back's up. So we've checked this lady. We've stood her up. And I'm only little. I'm only 5'4". She must have been less than 5 foot tall. She was this tiny little thing. And we've stood her up. The carers just stood there. Me and my colleague have undressed this lady because she's wet. And we've sat her on the chair. So it's the middle of the night, it's freezing cold. And the carers just stood there. And I said, "Can you go and get some blankets, please? Just cover her up." Then I had to ask her to go and get water so that I could wash her. I said, "She's been sat in her own urine." So I'm like, really like getting to the point. And I said to the carer, she went, "Oh, I haven't been doing this job long. I lost my job at the holiday place." And I'm like, I'm not complaining about carers because, you know, they're not well paid, they're not well trained, but I mean, common sense is like. So we've washed this lady, and I sat in front of her and she started crying. And I said, "What's the matter, love?" And she went, "I don't know what I've done wrong." She said, "1 minute I've got COVID and they lock me up, then I haven't, and then I have and they've locked me up again, and my husband died 2 days ago." And I was just like, oh my God. And I looked at the carer and I went, "Is this true?" And she went, "Yeah." So this lady had lost her husband and she was locked in a room and she'd been left on the floor in her own urine. And they weren't letting her family in. And I was just like, it's the cruelest that I've ever seen that we do to people. So when you've got a 94-year-old lady crying in your arms, what do you do? You know, it broke me, completely broke me. And I remember we weren't allowed to touch. It just was ridiculous. I'm a very affectionate person. If somebody needs, you know, I've been with people when they've lost their family. The first thing I do is put my arms around somebody. And they told us we weren't allowed to do that. I had this little lady in my arms, crying in my arms. And she said, it's just, I don't know what I've done wrong. It's like, you haven't done anything wrong. And I said to her, at this point, I've got my mask on, and I said to her, I am smiling. She went, I can see in your eyes. Because they took away that part of your face. And when you're walking into somebody who's scared, to be able to smile at someone. just brings them back down a bit. So we got this little lady. She didn't need to go to hospital. Thank God she didn't need to go to hospital. But I don't know what was the best thing to do for her, because if I took her into hospital, they would have put her on the COVID ward. But I was leaving her in this room with nobody. And her husband was in the care home as well, and he died in the care home. So I said to the lady, I said, we don't need to take you into hospital. And she was like, it's all right, love, you do what you need to do. And I said, we're going to get you back into bed. So we put her back into bed. And it was like putting a child back into bed. She was so tiny. I remember both me and my crewmate were in tears, because I was just like, I can't get over what we're doing to people. Then I remember walking out, I said goodbye to her. And we walked back out, and the carer walked out with us, and we got to the end, and I went, you need to let her family in. No, we're not allowed to. It's policy. I said, she's grieving, she needs her family. No, we're not allowed to. And I went, tell me why you have just let me in here. I've been at work for about 7 hours. I've been in and out of hospital. I've still got the same uniform on. I've still got the same shoes on. And I'm like, you would be putting that family in the same PPE as me, no different. I said, I'm high risk. Am I not? And I said, but you won't let the family into her. And they wouldn't let her. I got in that ambulance and I cried. Because I was just like, you don't treat people like this. It was just, people didn't see the cruelty that we saw. And it was just, you're dealing with all the rubbish that's going on in the hospital, but you're also dealing with people in the community. And when I went and spoke about that, it was just like, it's policy. And that's all I've got. It's policy. There was nothing I could do. I remember crying. I came home and I'm 5 years on, and I can't get over what they did. And it took, my mum was going, oh, can you go and talk to someone at work? She knew I was breaking mentally. And I said, but Mum, they're not listening to me. It's policy. I said, but what we're doing is cruel. I went to a gentleman. He came through. I still, to this day, I don't know who phoned the blooming ambulance. But we got there. And luckily, the back door was open. Excuse me. The back door was open. And we walked into the kitchen. And he walked in the kitchen, and then to the side was the dining room. And the man was slumped on the floor, and he'd obviously fallen, and he'd hit his head, and there was blood down the wall. But as he'd fallen, he was blocking the door, which went into the rest of the house. And in the rest of his wife was in the house, and she had dementia. And he was the carer. So obviously, that was another night shift as well. And we're assessing him. Obviously, we're not sure why he's had this fall, but he wasn't well. So we thought that maybe he'd had a stroke. But when you go in, you can see by people's colour and everything. So you know if it's big sick or small sick, as we would call it. And as I've gone around the house, we've managed to move him away from the door, and his wife, bless her, she was later stages of dementia. She had no idea what was going on. And I was looking around because we were trying to get information about him, because we need to know what medication he's on. So you start having to sort of be the you have to start searching. So I'm in the kitchen, and I've gone in the kitchen. Now there's washing up everywhere. There's ice cream on the side that's all melted. There's burnt baked beans in the pan. This is dangerous because they're obviously not coping. And we found all the medication in the fridge. So I don't know how I found it, but I found his son's telephone number, and it was about 2:00 in the morning, and I phoned his son, and this is when we were in lockdown. And I phoned the son up and I said, look, I'm from the ambulance service. We're here with your dad. He's had a fall, and we're going to have to take him into hospital. But my concern is that I cannot leave your mum here on her own. So I am going to have to take your mum to hospital with us, which is not ideal. But we had no other alternative. Now, he lived, it was about half an hour's drive away. And he turned around to me, he went, "Can I come down there?" And I was like, "Yeah." I said, "It's a medical emergency." I said, "We need to get your dad into hospital now." And we sort of tried to wait for him, but he was taking longer. And obviously our patient was starting to deteriorate. By the time we'd got him onto the carry chair to get him out of the house and everything. And I mean, this man was sort of half compos mentis, because we put him in the carry chair and we got him to the door and he put his arms out like that and he got hold of the door frame and he wouldn't let us take him out the door. So we literally had to strap him in the blanket. And his son, I phoned his son, I said, "Look, we cannot wait any longer. How long are you going to be?" And he said, "Right, I'm on my way. I should be there in about 10 minutes. So I said to him, "Which way are you driving?" I said, "Because we'll drive that way." And it was locked down, so there was no cars on the road, or it was deserted. So what we had to do was we had to get him into the ambulance, and then we had to lock his wife in the house and put the key in the door because we couldn't wait any longer. And I remember I said to him, "What car have you got? Look out for the ambulance. We're going to be going the opposite direction. Obviously, there's not going to be anybody on the road, so you'll see us." And we met him and we pulled over and he got on the back of the ambulance, and I remember his face. He knew his dad was ill. But I said to him, "You've got the chance to speak to your dad now. You've got 2 minutes before we've got to really rush." But you were in that sort of circumstance where the elderly were not being looked after. And, you know, there could have been a fire in there. That man had fallen over and nobody was going in to see them. The family weren't going down there because they were told not to go down there because of lockdown. And, you know, I said to him, "No, it's a medical emergency." And I said to him, if your parents got carers?" And he said, "No, we've been waiting, but because now lockdown, nothing's being done." So we were witnessing that, you know, what was happening to society out there. It
seemed to be a mass abandonment, didn't it? It was like a mass abandonment,
and it wasn't just the elderly; it was the children as well. I mean, I know that one of my crewmates had been to abuse, but this girl had been beaten by her dad. They were already under the radar, but they took them out of school, and they were left to be. And it's just like, you know, these children were vulnerable. Our elderly were vulnerable. The vulnerable people out there, they were just ignored, and nobody saw what we were seeing because, I mean, the GPs shut their doors. There wasn't the carers. They weren't getting the carers out there, so they weren't getting carers. And I was just like, but even the people that were seeing it were not seeing it as I saw it. They just accepted it. And it broke my heart. And I think in a way that was, for me to get injured in the October was such a blessing, because at the time I didn't think so because I loved my job. But I think when I look back now and I think I'm 5 years on and I still cannot get over what they did to that little lady in that nursing home.
And that was happening up and down the country, Nicola, wasn't it? That's the fact of the matter. So your experiences are multiplied across the whole of the NHS there.
Yeah, exactly. But nobody else stood up. Nobody else went, "This is wrong." They all looked at me. When I brought it up with my colleagues, they were all like, "Yeah, but we're in the middle of a pandemic." And I'm like, where is it then? Because I'm not seeing it. What I'm seeing is this government overreach of telling people what they do, and it's hurting people. And I was just like, this is not what I came into the service to do. I said, I came into the service, I want to help people. You know, I've worked in care for a long time. I used to work in the community with end-of-life patients. I have witnessed some pretty horrific things in my job, but nothing prepared me for what I saw in 2020. I've got a big heart, and I think my heart, it wasn't nice. I really didn't want to cry on this interview either, but I can't, my emotions were just, I'll never get over that. I'll never, what they did.
It
And
is.
this
It's
is why I want to
PTSD,
speak
Nicola.
to
For
you.
what you've seen, I think everyone, particularly anyone who's spoken out, it's not only the fear and the all the the
No,
nonsense from the TV propaganda. Everyone's lived
no,
through that, but from our side, we've spoken out,
yeah,
or we've objected to measures, or we've queried and questioned ethics, or some of that treatment in the nursing home. There was just you don't treat animals like that, and it was all because she'd had some dodgy lateral flow tests that are useless, and then she was treated like a
yeah.
prisoner, sat in her urine and uncared for by
Who
carers,
are,
like you say, who were locked. They were sacked because of they were companies were going bust, weren't they? The furlough scheme, so people were going from the
yeah,
supermarket into caring roles, and you've got to
yeah.
care to become a carer. Simple as that. But
I
people were
mean,
doing it to get by, and they weren't caring, as you saw with that
no,
case you mentioned.
no. I mean, the care sector is just awful anyway. I've worked in care and I've seen the other side of it. It's money making, it's not about care. I
Mm.
actually, my daughter's a carer now. And it was funny because my daughter's not vaccinated and she got a job in care and she wasn't vaccinated. And I'd left the ambulance service at that point. And she said to me, Mum, come and work with me at the care company. And I went, but I'm not having the vaccine. So I sent my CV off and I got a phone call within half an hour because obviously I'd worked in the ambulance service, I've worked in the hospital. And she was like, oh, we want you. And I went for an interview, got offered the job, and they said, oh, can you go out? They call it shadowing. So I was shadowing a 21-year-old girl who didn't have a clue what she was doing. I was telling her how to do her job because I said to her, you've done that and you haven't written anything down. You need to cover your backside because this will come back and bite you. And we had half an hour to go in and help this lady get showered, give her a medication, a breakfast. And when we got there, the lady was already dressed. And the girl said to her, oh, have you had a wash yet? I went downstairs. She hadn't had a wash.
Mm.
But we didn't have time to do it. And we went to the next job and we walked in there and the lady, she had a great big bruise on her arm. And I said, when did that happen? I said, have you written that down? Oh, yeah, I've left the office now. I said, write it down in the file to cover yourself. And then this lady put her in the shower. She had a rash all the way down her. And I turned around to her daughter and I said, when did that start? And she said, oh, we've been trying to get a doctor's appointment. This is when the jabs had come out. And I went, is she vaccinated? Yeah, she's had 2. I said, did it start after she was vaccinated? Yeah. And at that point, I said, you need to either get the doctors out. And she said, oh, I haven't got time to sit on the phone for hours waiting for the doctors. I said, well, then get her to A&E. I said, she's got a reaction to something and you don't know what's going on inside there. This could be blood poisoning or anything. And
What was your experience, Nicola? What was your experience of post-vaccine era? Did you see after the vaccine, just to sort of wind things up a little bit, is that,
no, because
was there an inflection point in things? You mentioned that rash there, but nothing major.
I'd come off the road by then. I came off the road in 2020. So when the vaccines came out, I was already off the road. So I can't say anything. I know what people have told me. I've still got colleagues that are in the ambulance service.
What are they telling you, Nicola? What are they sharing?
So straight away, it was an increase in strokes and also heart problems as well. So I mean, one other lady, she's my friend, she's a paramedic. She's actually having problems with the NHS as well at the moment. She's off the road. But I think that they mentally destroyed us people, the ones that actually cared, because we cared, they knew how to get to us. So the vaccine injury, I can't comment on that. I've heard obviously secondhand, but I've not witnessed it. But that lady that I went to in care, it was vaccine. But it was the mentality of the daughter. Well, I haven't got time. And I said, well, take her to A&E then. I just, I walked home after those 3 hours and I walked in, I said to my husband, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't. I said, that's not caring. I said, I need to do a job where when we were in the ambulance service, if I needed to stay with that patient for 2 hours, we did. We never left the patient until we knew they were safe. But in care, you're paid the lowest pay, and you're expected just to leave that person. And if you're late for your next call, you're in trouble. And I was like, I can't do this. I said, it's not about caring. I worked in the care company, and I worked my way up, and I work with end-of-life patients, and they were all, in a few years' time, we're going to be millionaires. And I'm like, you shouldn't be making money off people that are sick. That doesn't make sense to me. It just, people are profiting. The private care companies are just making so much money. I mean, my nana was in a care home. It was £1,500 a week. How is more than a bloody hotel? You probably get treated better and fed better in a hotel than. I mean, thank God my nana, she passed away the year before COVID, because I think I would have been arrested, because I would have taken her out of the nursing home. I wouldn't have left her. I couldn't have done. After seeing what I saw on the other side, it was just. It's the cruelest thing I've ever seen in my life. I don't ever want to have to live through that again. I mean, I lived through it.
Did you ever feel, Nicola, that you could, within the confines of working in the NHS? The question I've got really is, how does the NHS, despite encouraging whistleblowing, how does it work in reality? Do you feel supported if you whistleblow, or have you had to kind of wait till you've fled? You've fled to France, haven't you?
No.
Essentially, you're living in France and setting up other projects now.
I don't just run down the road, I go.
Yeah, this is why, just to explain that the feed here has been a bit juddery, because you are so far away, and it's been a bit juddery at times. But you've gone to France. But how do you think the NHS treats a whistleblower? What's your experience?
Awful. You can't. It's like a bullying. It's and because I was a minority, I couldn't speak out. And then when I did speak out, I was just shot back down again. Everything was, it's policy, but nobody was questioning that policy. And in the end, you start to think. I just got more and more depressed with the job, because nobody was listening to me, and nobody was seeing what I saw, because their mindset was just, no, it's policy. That's all you ever got. I never put in any complaints, because I actually just walked. In the end, when they told me that they wanted to put me into the office to read off a script, I was like, this is not me. I'm a hands-on person. I'm a patient person, and no, I just found the whole NHS, too many managers that have never done your job telling you what to do. And I
think you've literally nailed it. You've literally nailed it. There's too many jobs for us on high salaries, never been in clinical positions, and not, they're micromanaging for money. There's a big financial aspect rather than patient-centered. But as you mentioned, when you've made complaints, relevant complaints, and they keep falling on deaf ears, then you don't bother, and that's the problem. Then that completely suppresses
you give up, because you didn't get the support. I mean, like I said, that there was only 5 of us that I know of that didn't get vaccinated out of 300. So we were like a minority, and people are walking around. I remember working with one lad, and I said to him, I'm not wearing the mask. I said, because it makes me feel ill. The smell of it. I used to get headaches from wearing the mask. So, and they brought this policy in that we had to wear them when we were driving around. And I'm like, but why? And I remember working with this paramedic, and he was a very young, jumped up lad, putting it politely. And I said to him, I'm not wearing a mask. He said, I don't care about wearing masks. I'll wear it all day. And I just thought, you've just come out of university, love. You've just been told what you need to do, and you're doing as you're told. And he turned around to me and went, there's nothing wrong with the mask, it's all psychological. And I thought, you're young enough to be my son, love. And you're trying to tell me that it's all in my head.
Yeah. One of the things I never understood, though, one of the big things I never really understood was, if you've had your vaccine, if you've had your 10th vaccine, you're protected with your safe and effective Pfizer jabs. So it doesn't matter if Nicola or Dave have been vaccinated or not, you're protected. Same with masks. If if you've got your mask on and it works
Yeah.
as they believed it
Yeah.
did, which it clearly doesn't from the Cochrane review, then it doesn't matter if Nicola sat next to you without a mask on, their mask next to you is working. But
Right. This was always my argument, because every year they'd come around and they'd be pushing for the flu jabs. I've never had one of those either, because I'd heard of people that had got really ill from the flu jabs. So I was like, no, I've never been really ill with flu. My immune system's been pretty good. So the flu jabs came round, and this was the year before. This was in 2019. And I remember my team leader coming to me and he said, "Yo, do you want to go and get your flu jab?" And I was like, no. No, I don't want it, thank you, but no. And he's got this clipboard, and he's like, "Why don't you want it?" And I was like, "Excuse me?" He said, "Well, I have to write down why you don't want it." And I went, "That's none of your business why I don't want it." I said, "Do you ask people when they're having it why they've taken it?" I said, "This is ridiculous." Maybe that was the beginning of them getting us prepared. But why would they want to know why I don't want a flu jab before COVID came out? That just didn't make sense. I'm like, why did I? They would give the flu jabs at the station. That, you know, they were trained to give. Some of them are paramedic practitioners, so they were trained to be able to give those. And this one girl, she'd had it done for about 3 years, and every year her arm was the size of a ball. But she kept having it done because she was told to have it done. And I'm like, but it's making you ill. It just never, I think I was a bit too outspoken as well with things like that. So I was like, why? That doesn't make sense. So basically they were monitoring us from the year before to see whether
the dissenters to be. I mean, with me, the flu jab's very much, Dave, Scotland, would you like a flu jab? No. That's the end of it. I didn't even have to give a reason. But with the COVID jab, it was an incessant 10-week campaign of, if you don't have it, you're going to get sacked. And that just wasn't right. Nicola, I'm just conscious of your time. And last question I wanted to fire at you. It's quite a poignant one yesterday. So if you could, obviously we've both made out to be lunatics because we've questioned and all the rest of it. If you could go back in time and you had remember those old Polaroid cameras, and you've got 3 shots left, 3 shots to capture it for proof so that you can show your grandchildren and great grandchildren that Nicola wasn't barking mad. What would you take? What would you snap? Literally got 3 pictures.
Okay, my first one would be A&E. How empty it was. And that was not just where we took patients in, because obviously we took them into a separate place, but the walk-in centre, their walk-in A&E.
So basically all front of house places, you'd snap 1 of them or 2 of them. You've only got 3 shots, so second shot.
My second shot was, do you know what I would like to do is like to take a photo of the supermarkets as well. Going back to the traffic light system and the
arrows,
blue circles on the floor and the arrows. But I mean, if they ever look back at security, because I was in my uniform and I was running down the aisles the wrong way, because I was just like, no, I'm not being told what to do. So that would probably be my second one.
I used to love it though, Nicola, because people would be swarming around the toilet roll section. We got this worldwide pandemic and people are scrapping over, grabbing a pack of 4 bog rolls. And I used to go in and I'd be like, and people would flee. It's like the parting of the wave. But so and they had this big plexiglass thing, plexiglass, but they'd handle all your food, and then where you had to pay, there was a gap where the cashier was actually face to face with you. But so that's a bit supermarket carnage with the second one.
I'll quickly tell you, I went away with my daughter and my grandson in the September of 2020 when they were really starting to push for the masks, and I refused to wear one outside of work. And we stopped off at the services, and we went to a McDonald's. I say that pretty quickly. And I had to stand on this blue circle, and my daughter's sitting there, and I was jumping off it and jumping back, and she's like, "Mum." And then they made me stand in this Perspex, I don't know what it was, like this box that I had to stand in, and there was people in the one next to me, and I started laughing because I didn't have a mask on. And actually, I turned around and I was giggling because we were like, it's like racehorses. I said, our number's going to come up and we're going to be let out. But I started talking to the man and the woman next to me, and he saw that I didn't have my mask on, and he said, "Oh, I'm not going to wear mine." And we got talking, and I said to him, I actually work in the ambulance service in the NHS. And I said, I don't believe any of this. I said, I'm not seeing it. I haven't seen. And he went, well, we weren't sure whether to believe it or not. And I thought, I probably just helped one person there, because I wasn't quiet about what I saw. If people questioned me, people would say to me, oh, I bet it's really busy. And I'd be like, no, it's not. Right. Yeah. So my third one.
Last picture. What's the camera taking?
Right. So I would take myself back up to King's College Hospital in London when they brought out the mask mandate, and I stood and could have captured a really good photo of all the doctors and nurses walking around with no masks on. And that was a real eye opener for me, because
whilst making the patients wear them. Whilst making the patients wear them,
yeah. Yeah. And it was just like, well, or but they didn't even have them on their chins. They just didn't have them on. And I really regret now not having my phone and just storing all this information. I know it's up here, and whether people want to believe me or not, that's their choice. But I know what I saw, and I know that I'm not lying about anything. I only speak the truth. There's no point in me lying. I did my first podcast with one of my friends in 2021 in March. I wasn't shown on the screen, and I was under a different name because I was still working in the NHS, but I wanted to tell people what was going on. I wanted people to understand what I was seeing, because nobody else in the public was seeing what I was seeing, because they were locked down. And I got some really good feedback from that as well. But it's just, even back then, I mean, I was off the road back then, but it was still at the height of them pushing all the propaganda with it. And for me, it was good to be able to talk. And I know that some of my friends, I've lost a lot of friends. I've nearly lost my family. But I've made some really good friends, and there's a group of us that all got together, and we meet. Obviously now I can't see them as much, but we're all in contact with each other. And she said to me, and a couple of them, I'd never met them before, but they listened to what I said, and they said that they could then go to their friends and say, you know, she was front line, and this is what she's talking about, and it's not true what they're saying, because what they did is they stopped relatives going to the hospital. So nobody was seeing it unless you went to the hospital for an illness, and people were too scared to go to hospital. And, I've had people argue with me when people said to me, oh, was it busy? And I'm like, no, the ambulance service was probably the quietest that it's ever been in 2020. You know, we were sat at standbys, we were being bought pizzas and things like that. And they're like, yeah, but they must have made their own way to hospital. And I'm like, oh, do you know how the ambulance service works? People nowadays will phone 999 if they've stubbed their toe. Now, you tell me why we are in the middle of a pandemic and nobody's phoning. Oh, they make their own way to hospital. And I'm like, if they're dying, they will phone 999. I said, so tell me why, when you get to the hospitals are empty. I said, so where are all these people that are dying of COVID? I mean, we now know where they were, because they were in the nursing homes, and it's mainly, and I had somebody working in a nursing home, and she came to my house very asleep, jabbed up. She's probably had all the jabs now, and she sat in my garden and she was crying, and I said, what's the matter? And she was like, oh, people keep dying. And I was a bit like, but you work in a nursing home, and you know, as harsh as that sounds, a nursing home is there for a reason, because these people need to be looked after, and most of them are dying. And she went, no, Nick, we've lost 8 in a week. And I was like, oh. And she said, what they've done is the management have had an agreement with the local hospital, and we are taking in the people from the local hospital. And when these people turned up, they hadn't had their test results back. And then once they'd been put into the nursing home, they found out they were positive. whether there was the virus there and whether you believe them, but you would not put somebody into a nursing home the year before around people with flu who are vulnerable. So they were taking people out of the hospital. The nursing homes, who runs these nursing homes, were making a lot of money out of it. Again, which is what I said about private care. It's all about the money. It's not about care of the people.
Yeah. So on one hand, Nicola, you're saying that they're taking it uber seriously at the point of access to the hospital, where like everyone's treated like leprosy, even without symptoms. But then there was this unheard story, really, of people being discharged from the hospitals early into these nursing homes, and most died quite quickly. And I won't go in this interview because I've got an interview specifically about midazolam, end of life. You know, people being put on end of life for non-end of life. I mean, we all agree that, you know, when we've seen dying patients with cancer, it can be nasty at the end with anxiety, vomiting, you know, respiratory distress. There is a specific purpose for those drugs. People were being whacked on those syringes zealously.
It's a very difficult one because I've had this conversation with a lot of people because I know they put a blanket DNAR out on people. But I had to say to people, you know, my nana had a DNAR. My nana was 90 when she died. And I sat with my mum and dad and I spoke to them about it because I was like, look, she's 90 years old. If I have to go to a 90-year-old and perform CPR, it's not pleasant. I've done CPR on elderly people. It is not the nicest thing to do. I may be able to save them at that moment, but the damage that I have done by doing the CPR, you know, it just breaks the chest down. I don't want to go into it because there's people listening to this.
But these DNRs, like you mentioned, I think you got it right. The blanket DNR, it's like without conversation with relatives, the patient themselves, no capacity assessment. It was blanket. We were doing it to learning disability patients. People were signing treatment escalation plans, and it was all sort of all lockstep. All of these measures. It's
they just put it in, and I said, look, you've got to be careful how you work with this. I said, because like you've just said, you hit the nail on the head. With some people at the end of life, it's very traumatic. When your body starts shutting down, it's painful. And I had it with I've witnessed it a lot of times because I worked with end of life patients. So I know that once the midazolam and the morphine's put in, it's to keep them calm. But the way they were using it was so wrong. And there's this very fine line that they crossed. I mean, when my nana died, we had to put her onto midazolam because she became really aggressive, and my nan was not like that. And it was very traumatic for my family to watch that. And I'm the only one that's got any medical background. So I was trying to prepare my family for what was going to happen. But then when I found out that they were putting this blanket DNAR and they were putting everyone on, I'm like, they've crossed the line. I said, there's times when you should be. My husband's lost both his parents to cancer, and his mum was in a hospice, and they put her onto a lot of morphine. And one of the nurses spoke to my sister-in-law and said, oh, they put her on too much, and we need to investigate it. And I said to my husband, whatever happened, your mum was going to die. And to be fair, yes, they may have given her too much, but she died peacefully. She was in a lot of pain at the end. And I said, I mean, this was before 2020. She passed away in 2019. And I said, you're going to bring all this back up and you're not actually going to get anywhere with this, but you need to know that your mum, she passed away peacefully in the end. And I said, there's certain circumstances. That nurse who's brought this up wasn't there to see why that they had to increase her morphine. I said, every patient is individual. And I said, and this is where we go wrong. We don't look at people as a whole. We don't assess people as a whole anymore. I said, we had the same problem with his dad. I mean, his dad passed away 2 years later, and we do think that was probably because of the vaccination, because he was already diagnosed with lung cancer. And unfortunately, my sister-in-law took him to have his jabs against our wishes. And I think he had 2 in the end. and he passed away. But again, I had to say to my husband, look, we don't know whether it was the vaccination because he already had lung cancer, and we don't know whether it accelerated it or not. I said, we'll never know. And this is the problem, is they've buried so much of this as well. When I hope that more people like us who have witnessed it do come and stand up. Because I think we need to talk about this now. You know, what went wrong back in 2010 to 20 was horrific, and we're 5 years on, and we're still fighting this fight 5 years on. I didn't think we'd get this far, to be honest. I was hoping in 2021 that this would all be out.
And we still got, Nicola, we still got the same safe and effective crew that even now are jabbing people with their 9th and 10th jab, which is just insane. But
so I know it's just heartbreaking. And I think I said to you last night, my parents, I was devastated when I found out my parents. My mum told me that they'd had theirs. And I also found out that my brother and sister had had theirs and their wives. And I'm just like, you're never going to get that back. You know, I nearly lost my family over all this because I was begging them not to have that vaccine. I said, and I still remember the day my mum told me, and she was like, well, my parents are young. They're only 72. You know, they're young. And she was like, oh, but we're getting on and we want to travel. And I was just like,
that travel thing again, Nicola, it's that travel thing, wasn't it? There wasn't a genuine fear of the disease, it was travel. But Nicola,
I remember my dad turning. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you know, it's a good point to stop in that we've said, you know, it's time now in 2025 to look back and consider. I've said it in other interviews that why we became the doctor that we are, or the healthcare practitioner that we are. Why did we take up that role? Remind ourselves of it. Remind ourselves of the duty of candour. And this is why I'm doing these interviews, Nicola, because we need people like you, brave people like you. I mean, your story has been harrowing even for me to listen to it again after hearing it yesterday. But I just hope it stimulates people to see that, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see your passion for healthcare, your passion for your patients, the way you've spoken. And we've lost you from the health service. We've lost you forever. And it's such a loss. I'm about to lose my career. You know, several other COVID dissenters have been struck off and called dangerous and risks to the public. And it's just insanity.
I didn't go into my job for money. And that's where people go wrong in life. It's all about money. I mean, I've been very lucky that I restudied and I became a reflexologist. I'm a Reiki master, and I also do Indian head massage. And what I've learned from that is your healing is starting with yourself, and it's learning to de-stress. And I've always said to people, one of the biggest killers in this country is stress. You know, I've seen 40-year-olds having heart attacks. I've seen 30-year-olds having strokes. And when you ask them what their jobs are, they're usually you've got a lot of money, but you haven't got your health. If you haven't got your health, then you've got nothing. And I miss what I do. I really do miss what I do, and I miss doing my reflexology and that, because we've moved to France. So I'm hoping to reset it up again. I've got a few French clients that I see, but I get so much back from it. If I can see a difference in somebody, and they come back to me and they're like, oh, yeah, I've had Reiki, I do Reiki, and I come out of that and I feel great because I know I'm giving something back to somebody, and it's the beginning of their healing. And we've been taken away from healing ourselves because we've been taught that we have, if you're ill, you go to the doctor and they give you a quick fix. Well, it's not always a quick fix. You know, sometimes it takes a bit of time. I'm 5 years on and I'm still crying my eyes out about things that happened 5 years ago. I don't think I'll ever heal from that, but I'm trying. I think the thing of me moving to France was to take me away from it for a bit, to try and get my head back, you know, and find out what I want to do now. Because I got a bit lost when I left the ambulance service, but I think, you know, you're doing an amazing job. And like you say, they're losing the good ones. But I also think that alternative therapy and like supplements and things like that, as we were talking about last night, people will start to understand that, and their diets is a big thing as well. We're not taught any of that anymore. We're just taught to take a tablet, and then at the end of the day, the only people that is helping is the pharmaceutical companies. It's not helping us, and I think we need to take that back.
Goes back to that headline of a patient cured is a customer lost. It really does, and like you just mentioned, exactly my sort of mantra going forward is about holistic care. Stuff I was taught to be holistic care, biopsychosocial approach. Look at the root cause for that symptom. Don't just patch it up with a plaster, get them out the door. But that's changed now, and now I'm more naturopathic and doing more kind of consults that are a little bit more unusual to what you're doing.
Yeah, you look at the person as a whole. I mean, you may have I found it when I was doing my reflexology that people would like, oh, I've got knee pain, and I knew it was coming from their foot because I said, but the problem is you're not walking properly, and they had a thing called plantar fasciitis, and I'm like, but that knocks out your knee, and so they're having X-rays done on their knees, and I'm like, has the doctor spoken to you about how you walk or your feet or anything? No. So they're going and having knee replacements. And I'm like, but if we could work on this first, and maybe if we can bring something in that's like a supplement or something holistic to help with the inflammation, rather than going down the road of being put on, what was it called? The NSAIDs, isn't it? Ibuprofen and that. I mean, I was on that for 25 years. I've now got a lot of stomach problems because that's what the doctor told me to take. So for me, I learned probably the hard way, but for my age now, I think that I'm probably the healthiest I've ever been because I don't take any medication. I take one medication, but that's only one that I can't come off. But the rest of it, I've changed my diet, my outlook on life, and I take supplements now. And I'm very lucky because I can go walking every day in nature. And that's a big thing that we've had taken away from us is we live in cities. We're all confined in these cities, and we've been taken away from the trees, the animals. I mean, how much animals can help us as well.
Exactly.
I feel like we're now, for people like me and you, we're sort of doing a full circle. We're going back to how we used to be as like learning. I believe that God put on this earth, for every illness that we have, there is a plant out there that will cure it. And that's my belief. And so far, it's been working. So I think we just need to step forward, and it'd be great if more of us can think like that. And I think more are. I think it's changing. There's a lot to learn.
There is a big paradigm shift. Nicola, last thing to say really is thank you ever so much for coming on, identifying yourself, owning it, the bravery and courage that you've displayed, some of the emotional stories you've shared with us, and a bit of joint therapy for us both, really, to realise that neither of us are.
Thank you for giving me the time.
Nicola, amazing.
It's been nice. It's nice to talk to people who understand.
Oh, bless you.
Thank you.
Take care of yourself. Stay in touch, Nicola, and it's been great to chat.
I will do. I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.